just give you a little bit of history about Jonathan. So he has had the privilege of presenting to churches and various denominations, sports teams and young adult groups and students. He has taught in places as diverse as Russia and Solomon Islands. It's amazing you didn't cross paths with Ron before now. He has a bachelor's degree in both science and physiotherapy, is that correct? And those qualifications allowed him to be quite rigorous in his approach to research with the New Testament. Jonathan has published papers in peer-reviewed international journals and is a member of the Australian Society of Authors and Omega Writers. And he also cooks a mean homemade pizza, as I found out. So please welcome Jonathan Clerke.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming out on this night, even though there was some rain about. And as someone pointed out, it's so good that we don't have the rain that they are having in Victoria at the moment. And so our hearts go out to them. A little bit about my book, Echoes of Jesus. It is for sale at the back. It was a book that I wrote for my patients because I was looking for a book that you could give to someone who knew nothing about Jesus but had some curiosity, some inquisitiveness. A lot of people have questions about Jesus, those that know of him outside of a swear word, and but there's not that many books that answer some very fundamental questions in a way that it treats those questions with the respect they deserve, because often they're the same questions that you and I have had over the years. Questions such as, I remember when I was in high school, I became a Christian, my friends would say to me, "John, how can you believe that those Gospels tell you anything that's true about Jesus?" Because no one could read or write back then. They were all illiterate shepherds. So whatever was written down would have been done a long time later and people just made it up from poor memories. So the first section of my book was actually looking at literacy. Was it only the domain of the rich, or could the poor also read and write? Was it cheap to read and write? Were there cultures of taking notes while you listened to your favourite teacher? Did they know how to write history? Did they know the pitfalls of writing history? Was there a lot written? And so the first section of the book looks at those very basic questions, and I found a really enjoyable read because I had no idea, a really enjoyable study because I had no idea what I would come up with. Because even today, there are Christian books you can buy at the major bookshops that say no one wrote anything about what Jesus said or did for 50 or so years, because they thought that they all still were teaching that it's very expensive. The second part of the book is what we're looking at tonight, and that is, well, people would say, and once again, these are often people who are inquisitive, more so than aggressive. They say, but John, whatever was written had to be copied by hand, and then when those copies got old, then they had to be copied by hand again, and on it went. And so people added bits, they left bits out, they changed it. So whatever you're reading today, John, it's not the same as what was written back there. Some of the people I meet, they just regard this as a fact, like the sky is blue. They just assume that I'm on the same page with them, but I have this little blank spot when it comes to intellectual consistency, when it comes to reading the Bible, the Gospels especially. And the third section of the book looks at whoever wrote it were obviously, you and I would say, passionate, but most people would say they were biased, and they assume that that bias got in the way of telling the truth. And so I look at those three questions and a whole bunch of others, such as, for instance, how do we know Matthew wrote Matthew? When I listen to one of our government-funded radio channels, they get on there and they start talking about what everybody knows. Well, Matthew didn't write Matthew, Luke didn't write Luke. No one knows who wrote them, but it certainly wasn't Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. So there's a section in the book about that. It takes people on a journey of discovery. It's not listen to a question and then here's a response, here's a totally different question, here's a response. It's just a fluid journey of discovery that's very content rich. One of our missionary friends said she was so happy with the book she could give it to her teenage child. And as some of you have heard, one of my best compliments I think I've had is from an atheist patient who said, "This is so good, I'm buying extra copies to give to my atheist friends at Christmas." So I think I got it right in terms of it being content-rich, invitational and accessible. Talking about it being accessible, you can see it's in Russia, it's in Ukraine and Moldova because it's been translated into Russian and published in Russia. It's also in Arabic. I've got an Arabic version here. It's published in Egypt and it's for sale in Jordan. I mean, it's in our northern part of Iraq. It's in Libya. Lebanon, and it's been banned from Jordan. I think that's probably the best accolade you could ever get when your book's been banned. It's actually been confiscated at the border. I think that's very cool. So, we're looking today at copying accuracy of the New Testament. One of the experiences, if you're a Christian, is that sometimes when you're telling people the good news about Jesus Christ, you can tell that they're already disengaging. And sometimes the reason for that is that they're not really listening to anything you've said because of these other ideas they have. That what you're saying isn't something that a real Jesus Christ actually ever said. Or what you're saying he did, like getting tortured to death, actually ever really happened. So there can be reasons for that. Sometimes it's intellectual, most of the time it is. Sometimes there's been personal tragedy in their life. But I found that at least some of the patients that I came across who had terrible personal tragedy and were reluctant, therefore, to believe in an all-powerful and loving God, had exactly the same intellectual questions as everybody else, hot on those heels. They were wanting to know the truth, and not just from an emotional point of view. So Islam has a large number of followers, about 1,100 million people on earth. Australia has about 26 million people. So there's a lot of people who follow Islam. And Islam is an ideology, a religion that teaches that what we read in our Bibles is a great distortion of what happened in the past. So already there's a big hunk of humanity who believes that what we've got is very distorted. In the West, we have a lot of popular mass media products that keep rolling out every so often to tell you that the Bible is not worth reading because it's been twisted. Everything from Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code to misquoting Jesus to Lee Child and a Jack Reacher series. But one of the ones that I want to mention today is one that came out in 2015 in a Newsweek magazine article. So it had a circulation of about 100,000 people there. And the guy that wrote that major piece that's called the Bible, so misunderstood it's a sin, is a subtext, if you can't read that from where you are. The Bible, so misunderstood it's a sin. It's been written by a guy called Kirk Eichenwald. He actually won a prize for ethics and journalism. He was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize. So he's quite a well-known journalist. He had a book of his turned into a movie. And here he is writing about the Bible. He's not done any theological studies. He's not studied Greek or Hebrew or anything as far as I could ascertain. And he said words to this effect. Being a journalist, he's very good with his words. He's a great wordsmith. He said, "No television preacher has ever read the Bible." And he's in America. "No evangelical politician has read the Bible. Neither has the Pope. Neither have you, neither have I." He said, at best, all you've read is a bad copy of a bad copy of a bad copy of a bad translation, of a bad copy of a bad copy of a bad copy of another bad translation, and so on and so forth. And so he's making it pretty clear, the viewpoint that many people have, that what we're reading is really not worthwhile repeating, and that's why some people disengage very early on. What I find interesting is how many people aren't really aware of what we've got in terms of copies of the New Testament. My book's only about the New Testament, Echoes of Jesus. How old our oldest copies are. Now, on one hand, I've met some guys who were followers of a Bible, and they said they were shocked, absolutely shocked when I said, we don't have the original autographs anymore. We don't have what John actually wrote down anymore. We don't have what Matthew wrote down anymore. We've only got copies of copies. But on the other hand, I meet people or read about people like Kirk Eichenwald who says that we don't have anything until very recently. So turn to the person next to you and in 10 seconds, ask them what they think is the oldest complete copy of the New Testament in its original language. Off you go. You can see if you can come up with an answer. Oldest complete copy of the New Testament in its original language. Okay. So the oldest complete copy The oldest complete copy we've got of our New Testament in the original language is Codex Sinaiticus. Codex because it's in the shape of a book as opposed to the shape of a scroll. Sinaiticus because it was found at this monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai. It was found in about 1859 by the gentleman on the side there, Constantin von Tischendorf, a very colourful character. And it's called Codex Sinaiticus, and it goes back to about 350 AD. So we don't have to rely on a copy of a copy of a copy of something that was written in a totally different language. We can go all the way back to 350 AD for a complete copy. And there are other big copies, either almost complete or complete, from that same era. It's not the only one. There's Codex Vaticanus, Codex Alexandrinus from the 300s and 400s, and we'll touch on some of those later on. But even more exciting is we can go further back in time. So in the 200s, we have a lot of large manuscripts. Some of these were found in Aphroditopolis, a city in Egypt, in 1931, and the Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri. They all have fancy names, but they're just called P45, P46, P47. Sounds like an old manufactured car in Australia, doesn't it? And so some of those are big portions of the Gospels. And then we later on had the Bodmer Biblical Papyri, and they're about those 250s, 300 marks. So they're sort of biggish hunks. But then we can go back even a little further into the 100s. These are only scraps though. So some of you have probably heard of P52, P90 is less common, and P104. So they're tiny portions of scripture written on papyrus that we still have today. It's quite phenomenal, isn't it? You know, the first two are from John chapter 18. They're just a few sentences here and there. And the last one is from Matthew chapter 21. An important concept, though, is oldest manuscript is not necessarily the best or the most beautiful. Some more recent manuscripts have come from a chain of copyists, if you like, that have been more meticulous than some of the older ones that were only copied with less of a chain, but copied in a different style. So don't think that the oldest copy necessarily is the truest to the original. Just a little thing to keep in mind. Okay, we've covered a few things, so now you've got a chance to stand up, and I want you to think of some things you could take away tonight, just from what I've already said. So stand up, face each other. You can see that I used to be a physiotherapist, or still am. And just have a quick word to someone. You've got about 60 seconds, and just think of 2 or 3 things that you could remember from what I've already said tonight. Very good. We'll have a couple more takeaways as the night goes on. Very good. Okay. I find sometimes when someone has asked me a question about all sorts of things in life, in fact, but say they ask a question about copying of the New Testament, well, they actually say it as a fact, and surely you understand this too. You come from the same planet, don't you? That no sooner do I answer with 1 or 2 sentences, and they immediately deviate. They take a detour to another question, and that's the question of translations. So this is a very common side aspect of it, is remember what Kurt Eichenwald was saying. Not only have we got bad copies of bad copies of bad copies, but they come from bad translations. So I thought, well, let's have a bit of a talk about what's involved in a translation. Now, some of you are probably multilingual, and you already know that being multilingual, not every translation is bad. Some translations are very good. In that fact, we do live in a global economy, and most things that are translated into another language, usually they get the message and meaning across. Christians, though, we often like to believe that what we're reading is word for word. Now, those of you who are multilingual know that's not always possible. Sometimes there's not a direct word in one language for a word in a different language. What I want you to take home today is that if you're looking at something written in the original language, let's imagine you're watching a colour TV, therefore. You're picking up on so many different shades of meaning. You're picking up the energy from it almost. But imagine if you then watched that same movie in black and white. Is it a total distortion of what you would have seen if you'd seen it in the original colour? It's not going to be a distortion. It will be quite an adequate representation, most likely, of what you had seen in colour. So equally, if you're not fortunate enough to speak the languages of the Bible, Koine Greek and ancient Hebrew and Chaldean and Aramaic, and you have to rely on a translation of some sort, then yes, you may miss out on some nuances. I would say you definitely might miss out on some nuances, or you definitely would. But you will get an adequate and accurate representation of what was said there in the original Greek, or Hebrew, or Aramaic, or Chaldean. There is another way to get a bit closer, though. In English, I just saw this figure recently. Actually, guess how many English translations there are of the Bible that you could read today? Put your hand up if you think 100. No? 200? No? 300? Yes, 400. I thought, wow, we are spoiled rotten. So you can actually go onto a website like the Bible Gateway, and you could read a verse or a chapter or a book of the Bible that's been translated in different ways. And sometimes that helps you pick up on some of those shades of meaning you're missing out on because you don't have the colour TV. That's the first aspect of translation. The second aspect of translation I'd like you to take home is that some translations are easier than others, and this is because some translation activities are easier than others because the source language and the target language belong to the same major language family. So, for instance, Koine Greek is actually, that's the Greek of the New Testament, is Indo-European language, and guess what? So is English. So we belong to this same superfamily of languages. There's about 12 big superfamilies of languages. So that's already puts us off to a good start if you're an English speaker. The second thing is that about 150,000 words in English are said to have derived from Greek language. Some of it, of course, through the Romance languages, which are French and Italian. So already we have a fairly reasonable correspondence with the Greek in the New Testament. But of course the Bible, the New Testament's been translated into many languages. So the Greek is Indo-European. What's it like if it got translated into a totally different language family? So I've picked one, and this is the one that we're going to talk about tonight. So in Papua New Guinea, to the west of Papua New Guinea, is a big island called New Britain. Maybe some of you have been there. New Britain has a language group, and that language is called Lamagai, L-A-M-O-G-A-I, Lamagai. And so it belongs to an Austronesian superfamily, not Indo-European. So that puts it at a bit of a disadvantage. The second disadvantage for the people wanting to translate the Bible into Lamagai is that the language had never been put into written form. So David and Nancy Brunn, they turned up there in 1980, and their aim was to bring people to the awareness of Jesus and see churches planted. It only took them 21 years. So the first couple of years, they were getting to know the culture. After that, language learning, and that meant not only putting the language into written form, but then meant teaching the people to read and write, because now for the first time their language is in written form, and then of course you eventually get to translating the scripture. Now Lamagai, like many languages, has its strengths and weaknesses. English has definitely some strengths and weaknesses compared to other languages. Lamagai's one of its weaknesses, we would say, is that it has a paucity of what we call abstract nouns. Now, a noun, of course, is something like a shoe or a dog, something you can see or touch or eat. Some of you might have eaten dog. Abstract nouns are those things that you can't see, touch, feel, smell. Things like love, loyalty, stupidity. Some of these things are very closely related at times in our lives. So Lamagai has a paucity of abstract nouns. Now, one of the abstract nouns that we love reading about in the New Testament is what? Love, yeah. So love is a verb, and some of us have counselled people in love that, love is a verb, it's what you do, don't go by what he says, go by what he does. It's not just a feeling. But love is actually an abstract noun. Now, Lamagai did not have a language word for the abstract noun of love. It had a verb. So that means that when they're translating the Bible, when it talks about 1 John chapter 4, 1 John chapter 4, verse 4, it's verse 8, it says, God is love. So God is love. Love is the abstract noun there, it's not a verb. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 16, it says, God is love, and whoever lives in love lives in God. So you've got to translate it as an abstract noun. Now what makes it hard for Lamagai is that when you use the verb, you've got to say who is loving whom. You can't just use a verb without specifying both. So this is where it gets really interesting. We'll go back a slide. So if a man loves a woman, so John loves Anita, then the way it would transliterate in Lamagai would be John turns his insides towards Anita. That's how it transliterates. John turns his insides towards Anita. How are you going to turn that into an abstract noun? It's not going to make any sense. This is about as close as you get. God is, his insides turns towards. It makes no sense in Lamagai, and it certainly makes no sense in English. So they're going to have to come up with other ways, as translators, of getting the concept across. So no, when you read our Bibles in whatever language you have as your mother tongue, it's not always going to be word for word, but if it's a reputable translation, you have got a really good, accurate and adequate copy. Some people say, John, why have you got a heart and some other offal up there? We might think it's strange to talk about love in terms of your insides, your whole insides, but really we're not that weird compared to, they're not that weird with their language. In fact, I'd say they're superior. So in Hebrew language, the seat of your emotions is your kidneys. So when you read in Psalm chapter 7, verse 9, that Yahweh tests people's minds and hearts, in the Hebrew it's tests people's hearts. Of course, a heart in Hebrew was their centre of thought. Tests people's hearts and kidneys. Whereas we talk about, I love her with all my heart. So we would translate that differently. I like the Lamagai. You know, for those of us who have had those passionate moments of love towards a woman, it really does feel like your insides are just going all over the place, doesn't it? It's really distorted. So anyway, so that's the end of our little detour. I hope it helps you understand that some translations have benefits over others, and depending on what language, but they're all adequate. When it comes back to copying, so now we're looking back at our core subject tonight, copying of the New Testament. Obviously, when people make copies, no matter how good their intentions are or how trained they are, sometimes the copy is not exactly the same as the original. And this leads to variants or mistakes. So anyone got an idea, if we look at all the Greek manuscripts, or the manuscripts just means the handwritten copies, all the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament that we've got today, and we counted all the variations, how many we would have? 100,000? 200,000? Do I hear 500,000? We have about 500,000 variants if you look at all the changes, all the variations that exist in all the Greek manuscripts that we have still around today. That's about the same number of minutes in a year. So I thought we'd go through about half of them tonight. So let's see how we go. Not really. You can see that this is an introductory talk. I can't even talk about 1,000 of them. So we're going to talk in an introductory fashion about copying accuracy. Some people will say, well, John, if there's 500,000 variations, how many manuscripts are there? There's about 5,100 manuscripts. You'll get different counts. That's a good conservative count. You should feel very comfortable at telling people that. I think it's amazing. We've got 5,100 handwritten copies of the New Testament in its original language, spread out over the centuries. So someone says, well, how can anyone make sense of what the original should be if there's that many mistakes? Some of the mistakes are just spelling, or mistakes or variants, because spelling changes over time and from continent to continent. We spell colour C-O-L-O-U-R, and some unfortunate other English speakers in the world don't know how to spell it, do they? I think it's their economy is so poor, they have to cross out all the excess, like that U. So anyway, but here's an example. This came from David B. Wallace. He's a professor of New Testament. He did his PhD at Dallas Theological Seminary. I'd love to meet him. He seems like a very approachable guy. So this is his example. So does anyone know what this is? It's the Constitution of the US. It says it's second last line. So it was written originally in about 1787. In fact, in 1787. So let's read it. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, blah, blah, blah. It all sounds very grand, doesn't it? So imagine that this handwritten copy got copied, and it got copied and got copied, but eventually someone made a mistake, and that mistake got copied. So suddenly you got multiple copies that read like this. We, the people of the United States, what's it say? In order to form a more perfect onion. Now, if you didn't matter if you had 100 copies with the union being an onion, you'd know that's not right. You know it's not right for two reasons. One, contextually it's not right. And two, there are other manuscripts that help you to realise that it's definitely not right. But you might find some other copying mistakes. What's it read? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect anion. Chemistry test question for you people. So once again, if you didn't know what should have been there originally, but you knew the choices, you'd very quickly work out what's true and what's not. So that's called the onion effect. And to help you remember it, I brought some onions. So I'll throw these around, see if you can catch. Very good. Over there, you look good at catching. Bill, you got long arms. Very good. You can pass that to the back. Very good. And one right at the back. Whoop, perfect, thank you. So as you pass around these onions, and you get to keep whichever onion you want to keep, then I hope you'll at least remember from tonight the onion effect. There is a way of knowing how most of these are going to resolve. Okay, now copying inaccuracy is not something that only happened hundreds of years ago. So the US Constitution was written in September. The person who was tasked to write it was called Jacob Challis, not Shallots, Challis. Jacob Challis had between Saturday afternoon and Monday morning to come up with a beautiful handwritten copy of the US Constitution in September 1787. He only had to handwrite in beautiful fashion 4,000 words. I thought this would be an easy thing to do. He made mistakes. He left words out. You can see examples where he's left the word "the" out and he had to scratch it between the lines. So copying inaccuracy isn't always because someone's slack. It's not because someone's lazy. It's not because they're necessarily trying to be belligerent or twist something. It's just that accidents happen sometimes. So you shouldn't always think that if there's a copying variance, it's because of some malicious intent. Okay, how does all this stand when you look at the big picture? So Peter J. Gurry, he did his PhD at the University of Cambridge. So what he decided to do is look at John chapter 18. So John's one of the New Testament books, and he got all the Greek manuscripts of John that had John chapter 18 in them. So it's about 1,600 of them. So already he's got a big bit of research to do. And then he counted all the variations in John chapter 18, just in John chapter 18. So he's got a database of 1,300,000 words, and he finds that there's about 1,700 meaningful variations. In other words, not just spelling or something that was really obviously just a slip of the pen. So now we've got 1,700 variations, new types of variations, like onion was one new type of variation, anion was a different new type of variation. So he found 1,700 of these new types of variations. That's only one variation per 750 words. So it's not a lot. And when he distilled all those down, the handful that were left were easily resolved because of like the onion and iron analogy, so to speak, or they were not significantly meaningfully different. So you could have two adjectives very similar that made no real difference, or both. So when you read John chapter 18, there's no reason for you to have any date whatsoever about what it says. And of course, John chapter 18 is rich in historical content. It talks about Jesus being betrayed by Judas. It talks about Jesus being denied by Peter. It talks about Jesus being interrogated by the high priest. It talks about Pilate questioning him. And it even has that really important reference to Jesus being a king, but not from this world. You get to stand up and talk to each other about some things you're going to take away from what we've just said. It could be a fact, it could be an idea, it could be a half-remembered something, like a half-chewed bit of a morsel. But stand up, stretch your legs, and have 60 seconds where you try to give somebody a takeaway. Okay, afraid you have to take a seat. Now, as you remember, we've only got 500,000 variations to discuss tonight, and we've looked at 3 probably, so let's move on. So, one of the questions I look at in my book is, were any of the changes deliberate? And of course, if you go to some of the Islamic websites, some of the atheist websites, they're very good at showing you quotes from what would appear to be a Greek New Testament Christian scholar saying that the New Testament was copied deliberately inaccurate. Some of the copyists deliberately made changes. And of course, most of us would automatically assume, I remember when I first saw one of these quotes, oh, that's not very good. You immediately assume that a deliberate change is going to be something that's malicious. So let's go through 1 or 2 of them. So P45 was a set of papyrus that we still have that goes back to about the 200, 250 AD mark. And in Luke chapter 11, verse 19, the scribe, the copyist of P45, left out a word. Now, how do we know whether that was intentional, deliberate, or accidental? We know because there's a pattern of what this man or woman did over time when they were doing their copying. And what this man or woman did is that they got rid of redundancies. So if I said I'm wearing a blue coloured shirt, there's a redundancy there, isn't there? A blue shirt is a blue coloured shirt. So if I was being efficient with my words, I'd leave out the word colour. P45 scribist, copyist, didn't like redundancies, but I would still say was very restrained. We've just got one example. It's from Luke chapter 11, verse 19. Jesus had been casting out some demons. Some of the bad guys said to Jesus, oh, we think you're doing that because you're actually a representative of Satan yourself. And so there's this argument about, who drove the demons out of who and by whose authority. So Luke chapter 11, verses 14 to 18, keeps talking about the demons being driven out, the demons being driven out, demons being driven out. By verse 19, the copyists had enough and just left out the word demons. And you see that pattern. So that's how we know that the copyist was deliberately making changes, but was it consequential? Was it malicious? Did it change any of our doctrines? No. So just because you can read an alarming quote doesn't mean you need to be alarmed. Codex Alexandrinus. Codex Alexandrinus goes back to the 400s. We're lucky we still got it today. It was thanks to a heroic action of a Dr. Bentley, a librarian, wearing only his PJs and a very big wig. He managed to save this codex from a fire in about 1731. So some of these books, these codices, are very interesting stories. Now, when you read Codex Alexandrinus in John 9, verse 35, it's got a change. Instead of talking about the Son of Man, it talks about the Son of God. Well, was that deliberate or was it accidental? I mean, any of you that read the Gospels know that sometimes Jesus is the Son of Man, sometimes the Son of God. Well, we know that in this case it certainly didn't appear to be malicious, because the same scribe later on talks about Jesus being the Son of Man. So it's not a consistent behavioural trend. And that's how, once again, we can know whether some of these mistakes are intentional or not. This is a scene from when Jesus spat on the ground, made some mud, and then healed a man who had been blind since birth. Some changes we see in our New Testament. So when you're reading NIV or New American Standard Bible, you'll see footnotes if you've got a version that has footnotes. And sometimes they'll say statements like, some manuscripts say this, some manuscripts say that. And you can already start to pick up, oh, these are really inconsequential. Some of them touch on what we often hear in church. So Luke 23, verse 34, if you've been to church for a year, you've probably heard it 6 times already. It's the words that Jesus said from the cross about, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Many people would say, well, that may not have been originally in the finished copy of what Luke wrote, but most people believe it's an authentic thing. It's something that Jesus Christ really said. What would it look like if our Bibles didn't have it? It wouldn't change. We still have Luke chapter 6, verse 27, where Jesus says to bless and do good and to pray for who? People who hate you, people who curse you, and people who are mean to you, basically. So we don't need those verses there. We already know from elsewhere in the Bible that Jesus was forgiving himself. So there's this redundancy, if you like, about some of the core teachings in the New Testament. So if someone said, this particular passage about Jesus actually being God, not just man and not just human flesh, you wouldn't have to worry, because the New Testament screams out loud and clear that Jesus was both fully God and fully human. Do you like his beard? Some of you might have sons who've got beards like this and you think, that's some sort of punk aberration. I'm sorry, but this guy was sporting that beard back in 1582. He was a Christian then. He started off as a really wealthy lawyer in Paris. He had oodles of money. He got sick and he saw the light, and the rest is history, excuse the pun. In France, has anyone been to France? Has anyone been to Lyons? Oh, well, in Lyons there was a bunch of Huguenots. So some of you might actually come from Huguenots. They ransacked a monastery. I think they burnt it down. And they stole this codex, and they gave it to Theodore de Beze, and therefore we call it Codex Bezae Cantabrigiensis. So it's called the most controversial version of the New Testament we've got. So if you want to see the weirdest version of the Gospels, where would you go? Codex Bezae. If you want to see something that looks more fundamentally similar to all of what you and I read, you might go to Codex Sinaiticus or Codex Vaticanus. So what I did in my book with the book of Acts was I thought, if all we had was Codex Vaticanus, would it change the story, essentially? Would it change any of our core doctrines? And I went through that with the book of Acts, just the first 4 chapters. You'd be amazed how many core doctrines are in the first 4 chapters of Acts. It makes it clear that Jesus is God, he's the creator of the world. It's really exciting. I was going to go through Matthew, a guy called Laurent Pinchard, 2015. I'm not jealous of him at all. His mother tongue is French. His mother tongue is French, his heart language is Polish, and he's obviously commensurate in Greek, and he wrote his thesis in English. But why would you be jealous of him? So he did a study on Matthew, and I went through his thesis. It's a few hundred pages long, and picked out the differences that exist in this most controversial version. Now, because we've only now got 2 minutes, I'll race to the end. What I did was I looked at, what happened when it left out a word? Was that important? What happened when it added a word? Was that ever important? What happened when it added 7 words in one place? What happened if it even added 61 words in one place? I'll talk about this one. So you'd think, surely, John, if someone adds 61 words all in one place to Matthew's Gospel, that's got to have changed things. Well, no, sorry. It's basically a repeat of a parable that we read in our Bibles in Luke chapter 14. And this makes sense, doesn't it? Because what do we read in the closing verses of John's Gospel? Jesus Christ did and said many other things that probably couldn't be written in all the books of the world, excuse the hyperbole. So it's not surprising that also Jesus was a great teacher and he repeated himself and sometimes changed versions. So if you're worried about suddenly there's an extra 61 words, I'm afraid that it's a parable and it doesn't teach a different message. Sometimes changing one word does seem powerful. So this is not from Laurent Pinchard's work on Matthew. This is from Mark's Gospel. So this is a case where one word at first blush looks like it's changing everything. So Mark chapter 1 verse 41, a leper approaches Jesus. And the leper says to Jesus, what? Can you heal me? Yeah. He didn't want lunch. He wanted to be healed. And in the NIV, depending on which version you've got actually, it says, Jesus felt compassion, great sympathy, all these lovey-dovey words, and he did his thing. But in Codex Bezae, it says that Jesus was filled with anger. And people go, well, that's not right. But the story continues on. Remember, he tells the leper what? I am willing to heal you. And then he does what? He reaches out and touches the leper. Is this what someone says who is angry at the person? No. This is what someone might do who is filled with compassion and love because they are the Son of God, but also they're angry at what they see that sin has done to the world. Jesus was at times angry. We read that in Mark chapter 3, verse 5, just a couple of chapters later on, where he's angry at people's stubborn hearts because they couldn't see the value in healing someone's deformed hand on a Sabbath day. Jesus cried, that's the whole verse actually, Jesus wept, in Luke 11, verse 35. I used to think, why the heck would he cry? Yes, his mates died, but he knows that he's going to raise him up again, in about a couple of minutes' time. So, what's the big deal? Why these fake crocodile tears? What's going on? Of course not. He's crying, they're genuine tears, because it's death. And what does our New Testament say about death? It's the last enemy to be destroyed. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 26. So, could Jesus have felt great compassion and sympathy for the leper in Mark 1, verse 41? Yes. Could have he also felt angry at that moment? Yes. Does it change your view of Jesus? No. Does it change the way you're going to treat a leper? No. Now, we've run out of time. So, I want to finish with David and Nancy, where the men turn their insides towards the women. So, one of my favourite verses for a long time is Mark 10, verse 45. And it's, for even the Son of Man, it's Jesus speaking about himself, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And that's great words for us. If you've been ransomed, if you've asked Jesus to take your punishment, to take your price and set you free. It's great words of hope if you haven't done that yet. But it's also an indication of why some Christians do what they do. David and Nancy Brunn spent 21 years. They went from America to New Britain. Believe me, it doesn't look like New Britain. It didn't even look like Britain once upon a time. It's a poorish, we used to say a underdeveloped country, to translate the Bible into Lamagai. Guess how many people spoke Lamagai back then? 4,000. 21 years of their life given to show love to a group of people that only were about 3,600 to 4,000 big. Enormous love, isn't it? So whenever, I think of all the times I don't want to be loving. and yes, I can use Jesus as example, but it's so great to have examples of so many other people all around us to know that with God's help, we can do crazy love. We can turn our insides towards others. How about we finish with prayer? Oh, thank you, Jesus Christ, that we can be so confident that we have an accurate and reliable record of what you said and did as you walked among us. Thank you for taking on human flesh so we could know what you are truly like. Help us to love you more. Thank you for people like David and Nancy. Amen.
Well, I think we can give both Jonathan and Ron an amazing hand. Just before we go, we'll open up for questions. We'll do that right now, and then I'll just take you through a couple more things and we'll finish up the night. We have one question first, and then we'll try to grab one more question after that.
Thank you, Jonathan. I just didn't catch, what was the final translation that the Brunns put in for that?
Yes,
verse?
I was fearful someone would ask this question. I listened to him give talks, because we're privileged enough to be able to do that. I read his originals, And I thought, surely, if you bring this up 3/4 of the way through your paper, you're going to tell us in the last sentence. But he never did. But I think I can track him down, or Nancy, and ask them. So I'll keep you posted. Maybe I'll share it as a blog post. I imagine that what they did is that they added words to the effect that God, in a consistent and usual way, loves, turns his insides towards others. That is what he does, as always does. That is who he is. I don't know, but I hope that helps. Yeah, but I did search far and wide.
And do we have one more question? Anyone? Yep, right down the back. Oh, I've got to get fit. Okay, then.
Thank you, John. Could you give some insight into the validity of including apocryphal books?
Sure. So the question was, would I be able to comment tonight about why we basically, let me know if I've got it wrong, why we've got the books we have in our New Testament and not other books, and why were some books, some people would say, excluded? Was that an arbitrary decision? What I would suggest is that you get me back another night. A very quick summation is that, did someone tell a previous generation that the Beatles made great music? No, no one really had to tell people that. I wasn't a fan of the Beatles, by the way. I loved Led Zeppelin and other groups. But I can understand sort of why people might like the Beatles. But there was never a need for someone to say, the Beatles are good, you should listen to their music. It's because, in many people's minds, the Beatles made good music, that they were popular. That's probably the best analogy to why we've got the books we've got. The early church, which what we mean by that is the various church communities, gatherings of Christians around the world, knew what was good because of what had already been circulating and the Jesus that they had known from word of mouth, if you like, from hearing him with their own ears and eyes, or from hearing a disciple. So John the disciple had 2 disciples, Papias and Polycarp, and they had other disciples. So there are ways for them to know what was good, apart from what was obviously already consistent. So I'll have to leave it at that, but a great question, especially if you're Roman Catholic, because the Roman Catholic Bibles actually have a few extra books. Thank you very much. Great question.